Welcome to Norse Mythology, the unofficial guide. It's unofficial because I'm neither a credentialed academic nor a time-traveling medieval Norse pagan, but I deal with this material directly from the sources, interpreted through the lens of the experts and their opinions. If you're looking for depth and detail in a simple and accessible way, then you're in the right place. Welcome to Norse Mythology, the unofficial guide. Today I'm really excited to have another interview episode, and today we have with us a man who has worked very hard to keep his anonymity on the internet, so we're going to allow him to do that. But you can trust me that I vetted him and he knows what he's talking about, especially on the topics that we're going to be talking about today. So I would like to introduce you all to a somewhat celebrity in the internet Norse mythology sphere. This is AtiWati, who moderates the r/Norse subreddit. Ati, it's great to have you. How you doing?
I'm glad to be here. Kind of cringe about the celebrity. Ooh, makes me tingle, but I'm excited to be on.
Maybe minor celebrity is a better word.
I don't know, man. But it's good to be here.
Awesome. It's great to have you. So one of the things that I've noticed in reading through a lot of the stuff that you've posted online is that you are very, very interested in Saxo Grammaticus and his work Gesta Danorum. And I would love to ask you a few questions about specifically Saxo so that we can maybe start to get our minds around who this guy is and what this book is that he's written, because I think a lot of people are sort of scared to read Gesta Danorum. They don't really know what to do with it. So I'm hoping that maybe you can help break down for us what this thing is and maybe help make it a little bit more approachable.
Of course, let's do it.
Awesome. So I guess just to kind of start off very, very basically, who was Saxo Grammaticus? Who is this guy? He has the coolest name, but surely it means something. But who was this guy? When did he live? And what's he all about?
Well, Saxo Grammaticus was a Danish historian living in the 1100s and early 12th century. That's the same thing, I guess, 1200s. And he wrote this story about Denmark's history called Gesta Danorum, which is like this hybrid split between legendary history and true, in citation marks, history. And he was the first author we know a lot of legendary traditions and Epic material from. And he wrote in Latin, of course, which has earned him the ire of many commenters. Yeah. He was kind of a keyboard warrior, I would like to call him. He was an aggressive man. Every reader who opens up the book will realize this, because it's all about war and like manly virtues of the olden days and stuff like that.
Right. So, that's really an interesting point. I was reading a little bit of Gesta Danorum, of course, in preparation for this. And of course, I was picking up on all the stuff you said. He's all about manly virtues and war and stuff. And yet he seems to be devoting all of his time to sitting in some library or something somewhere, writing this thing. And he spends a lot of time condemning people with sort of pampered lives and pampered professions who enjoy comforts and good food and stuff like that. Is that not the life that Saxo led himself?
It's tough to answer. I would guess that his views in Gesta Danorum are way exaggerated. I can't imagine him enjoying eating half-rotten smoked food like his heroes does at all. So I guess he is kind of a hypocrite in that fashion. But it's also virtues he lays out are also supposed to be like an instruction to kings and warriors in Denmark to not let all those degenerate Germans get the better of them, but keep the heroic old ways.
Right. So he spends a lot of time bagging on stuff that comes from the Saxons in particular, which I thought was interesting. He mentions, I think, some of the other groups in Western and Central Europe a little bit as well. But I noticed he likes to insult, what did he call it? Something like the voluptuousness of the Saxons or something like that.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, and it's because it's a recurrent theme in Danish history. Like, we have to constantly assert that we are not Germans, we are not dependent on Germany.
Right.
And this was an important goal in Saxo time because the first king of the dynasty he wrote about, Valdemar I, he accidentally swore fealty to the Germans. Kind of an embarrassing move. And there's also this constant struggle to mark the Danish church as dependent on Rome and not, as it had been earlier, dependent on the German archbishoprics.
Gotcha.
So it was like, yeah, so it's a political goal that Saxo projects backwards into time.
That makes sense. So, okay, so why does Saxo write Gesta Danorum? As I understand just sort of the very basics, he's working for this bishop and he needs to write a history of the Danes. But what's the rest of that story? Because that's essentially all that I know about it.
Yeah, as you say, he was commissioned by Absalon, the archbishop, to do it. And he says in his foreword that other nations had a habit of boasting of the deeds of their ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
And Absalon had always burned with this zeal for glorifying his fatherland. So he would not allow Denmark to go without a historical work of comparative status. And then Saxo goes on to claim that no one else had written a history of Denmark, which is a total lie, and he knew it was. But he didn't deign to name or even acknowledge these works. And of course, none of them had the scope of Gesta Danorum. It seems like works that Saxo mentions, he mentions like Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, Paul the Deacon's History of the Lombards, and Dudu of St. Quentin's History of the Normans. Mm-hmm. And these are like all these massive national epics of established Christian Germanic nations. And I think Saxo, he endeavors to like construct this similar monument to the Danes that can compete with these works. And also, Europe remembered the Vikings, and right. Europe knew where they had come from. And even though Denmark had been Christian for at least 2 centuries at this point, other European writers routinely described Danes and other Nordic peoples as like coming from the ends of the earth, where the church was still fighting bitterly to stamp out pagan rites. Mm-hmm. And Saxo's employer Absalon, he was at the receiving end of this. He received letters demanding reparations for Viking raids in France, reminding him that since he was descended from these very same Vikings, it was only proper for him to like pay up.
That is fascinating.
Yeah, so a document like Gesta Danorum had immense value in placing Denmark within the proper European context of other nations, while also establishing Denmark as an independent entity from Germany and Rome.
Right. So it sort of has these various purposes inside of it where Saxo needs to make Denmark or the history of Denmark seem awesome for Archbishop Absalon, and also he has to include reasons for Denmark to be taken seriously as an independent country, and then also to be viewed as part of this Christian community of Europe, correct?
Exactly, and he does this by like constructing ancient Denmark like as the counterpart to ancient Rome. Mm-hmm. Which is, of course, like supremely megalomaniac, but that's what he sets out to do.
Right. Well, yeah, because he spends a lot of time in the beginning giving us these euhemerized stories about the gods, right? And that's what I think is going to be really a draw for a lot of people listening here is Saxo's take on, the gods and Vikings and people from the Norse pagan era. But he has a really interesting take on the gods. It's similar to some of the stuff that we see in the prologue to the Prose Edda or in Heimskringla by Snorri, right? But he's got his own spin on it. Do you mind walking us through sort of how Saxo presents the Norse gods?
Yeah, sure. As you say, it's comparable to the Icelandic material where the Aesir, they are like these ancient migrants from somewhere in southeastern Europe, Troy preferably. And of course, they can't be real gods because there's only one god for these authors, and it's the one of the capital G. So there must be something else. So these wizards, conjurers of cheap tricks, really migrate into the north and establish themselves as false gods, really. And it's the same basic story that Saxo uses. He describes in this famous passage that there were two groups initially competing for the status of godhood. There were the giants and the wizards. And both could perform magical tricks, but the wizards won out in the end because they were smarter.
Right.
Then they produced a third group, the offspring of the two, like a crossing. Two of them, which were neither as giant or as magically skilled as their predecessors.
Right. And so the giants are interesting in Saxo as well because he's writing in the 1200s. And it seems like at this point, even though we talk all the time about how in Norse mythology, the giants aren't actually gigantic beings as a class, but Saxo often describes them as being pretty gigantic, right?
Yes, absolutely. Their size is the defining factor in Saxo's description, and it's easy to tell he had this systemic description of them. All giants are giant, but it's like in the Icelandic material, some giants are truly giant, but all giants in Gesta Danorum, giant.
Right, and he even uses, the Latin word he uses is like gigantes, right? Or whatever that is in Latin, something like that. I'm drawing upon my Spanish and trying to reverse engineer a Latin word here.
He does. Gigas or gigantes, it has been used by learned authors in Europe since the 7th century to describe a variety of vernacular supernatural agents. So he's not unique in that regard.
Mm-hmm. So I suppose if I was to read Gesta Danorum for the very first time as my very first introduction to any sort of Norse mythological material, and then later hear somebody tell me that giants are not giant in Norse mythology, I think I'd be very confused. Is this because Saxo is just sort of conflating ancient Norse traditions with what is kind of commonplace folkloric or mythological material across Europe? Is this something that is drawn from biblical inspiration, or how have giants become gigantic in Saxo's mind?
You left out the last option, which is all of the above, because it really is a blend of like the vernacular giants who might be giants sometimes in some stories.
Every once in a while, you get a mocha coffee or something.
Yeah, exactly. But then every learned man in Europe at the time knew that at some point in the most ancient past, there existed giants, and this is mentioned in the Bible, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like a conflation of these two things, and then giants in like classical sources. And it's very typical of Saxo, really, this blend of native Scandinavian material and then Christian material and classical material.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So and to me, that's kind of the trickiest thing about reading Gesta Danorum is I have a tendency to read something that sounds cool and think that I've just discovered some new pearl of wisdom about Norse mythology, but I always have to check myself and say, well, there's a good chance that Saxo is not necessarily giving me something original to pagan belief here. There's a much bigger chance that he's probably giving me some sort of more I don't know what's the right word, analogized Western European version of thinking about things.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's actually a bit of an unfair assessment because the most part of his material is just like reading any of the legendary sagas from Iceland, like later periods. And in these sagas, giants are often giant as well and monstrous. But I get what you're saying, like you have to be aware of these textual layers and various traditions that Saxo used very deftly to make his own work.
Right, that's a great point. So whereas Gesta Danorum may be pretty different from Eddic poetry that we get in the Poetic Edda, for example, it's not too different from the sagas that are coming out of Iceland from around the same time.
Oh, not at all. And I mean, Saxo, his sources, which will always be like a point of contention, but he probably knew about the same material as Snorri Sturluson did later on. He was very well informed because the city he wrote in, Lund in Denmark, was like, it feels lame to say, but it's like a cosmopolitan area where you had like Icelanders and Norwegians and of course a lot of Danes, and like this international milieu in which Saxo could find informants and find texts to draw upon.
Mm-hmm. So I've seen the question raised about whether or not Saxo had read works by Snorri and was influenced by them. Do you have an opinion on that?
I do. It requires to go into the dating of Gesta Danorum, and he most likely had begun writing around the year 1188. And the reason we know this is that another Danish historiographer, Svend Aggesen, wrote one of these Danish royal histories that we talked about before that Saxo didn't mention.
Right.
Svend mentioned Saxo. And he says that Absalon had informed him that Svend's colleague Saxo exerted himself for a long time writing a history of all of those kings in an elegant style. And Svend ended his royal history in 1185, same year as Saxo, and finished writing it not long after that. So that's like an estimate of when Saxo had begun writing.
Mm-hmm.
And then the foreword to Gesta Danorum gives us a rough idea of when he finished it, because it was most likely the last section of Gesta Danorum that was recorded.
Sure.
And Absalon had died before Saxo finished, and so he dedicated it to his successor, Anders Sunesen, built the sea from 1201, I think it was. And he also dedicated to King Valdemar II, who reigned from 1202. So far, so good. And he also mentioned one of Valdemar's campaigns in which he crossed the river Elbe. We know from other sources that Valdemar did so in 1208, and he would absolutely have done so. So we know he was writing around 1188, finished his work probably not long after 1208. The prose Edda is usually dated to close to 1220, maybe a decade later. The Poetic Edda is from 1270, but might be a few decades older. So Saxo was first.
Interesting. Okay, so I wonder then if it's possible that Snorri, assuming Snorri had anything to do with the Prose Edda, it makes me wonder if Snorri had read anything by Saxo. So the reason I mention this is because I think you and I talked one time about how there are these two stanzas of a poem about Njordr and Skadi that show up both in the Prose Edda and in Gesta Danorum, and it's just those same two stanzas. And it would seem like the simple fact that it's just those two in both cases would mean that either both of these authors were drawing on the same prior material, or that one of them was influenced by the other.
Some scholars have been cheeky and suggested that Snorri might have read Saxo, but nothing really suggests that Snorri knew Latin, really, and Gesta Danorum is a very complicated text. But it's true that those two stanzas appear in both texts, and to my mind, there's no question if Saxo had a manuscript in front of him when working with these two. And I think there's like this broader question of the Eddic material circulating. When did it begin, really? I think it must have been circulating in text form already by Saxo's time.
That makes sense. So what are some other things, I guess, that people should keep in mind as they begin to read Gesta Danorum? And I should mention as well that I've mentioned before on the show that it's this great big multi-volume work, and it is, but it's also not difficult to approach in terms of readability. If you read the Carsten Friis Jensen and Peter Fisher version, for example, it's very simple language, easy to approach, easy to comprehend. Lots of great stories about, people getting sliced in half or fighting dragons, or men punching women in the face, crazy things like that we don't see a lot in modern popular media, right? Or unless it's designed to shock us. And so, but I mentioned that I have kind of this mindset that I try to keep in mind, and then you mentioned it wasn't necessarily a fair comparison, which I think is great. So, what is the right mindset to have for, let's say, somebody kind of newer at this, approaching Gesta Danorum for the first time?
Well, I think people should just read the thing. The first 8 or 9 books or so will probably be the most appealing. It's the legendary materials with heroes and dragons and gods and whatnot. And just be entertained, really, because when you just read it as is, it doesn't differ at all from legendary sagas, which are the best sagas, in my opinion. But as you start to, if you want to deeper into it, you have to realize that Saxo, he has a plan. It's a complicated plan and crazy plan even, but all levels of Gesta Danorum are planned out. So we can take the first book, for example. The first king, Dan, whatever. He is chosen to be king because of his fortitude. Is of course a classical virtue that Saxo repeatedly pounds upon. And every king, book 1 is all about fortitude.
Mm-hmm.
Then book 2 starts the dragon slaying. What are dragons? They are greedy.
Right.
So this is a book about generosity, really, because you can't be a king, a prince, or any person with status in Denmark, in Iceland, wherever, if you if you don't want to pay up.
Right.
Yeah, and it's a theme that we see already from Tacitus, right? That there are all these great Germanic leaders, and they give all their wealth to their followers, as they should be doing.
Right. That theme carries throughout everything. We see that in Grimnismal, for example. It shows up. Yeah, it shows up in pretty much anything with a king. Either he's good because he's generous, or he's bad because he's not.
Exactly. And he keeps building upon all these virtues and contrasting them with good kings, bad kings, good counselors. Very important, because he spends a lot of time heroizing Absalon as Valdemar's counselor.
Mm-hmm.
Gets pretty ludicrous at times. So there are all these themes.
You got to get paid,
Yeah, it's pretty ridiculous.
Right.
But there are all these things and themes that he constantly brings up. And then there's also the case of the composition of Gesta Danorum, because it's split up into 16 books, which is not a truly odd number, but odd in the sense that it's unusual.
Mm-hmm.
And it has to do with primarily with the Aeneid of Virgil, because he has also, I think he has 12 books, and in book 6, Aeneas goes into the underworld and receives the prophecy that will define Rome as a nation,
right,
for all time. Right, and then we have in book 8, for example, in Gesta Danorum, well, what do you know? An underworld journey heralding the coming of Christianity. Wow, the coincidence.
Right.
Right. So there is a plan. The first 4 books are the history of Denmark before the birth of Christ. In books 5 to 8, it's Denmark after the birth of Christ, and then the establishment of the Danish church is the third quarter, and the establishment of the Danish archbishopric is the last quarter.
Gotcha.
It's a book with a plan.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you mentioned a minute ago a few scholars being cheeky in proposing some things. I'd be interested to know, what are some of the most common misconceptions, not only that maybe regular people have about Gesta Danorum, but even that you've seen in the scholarly community?
Well, the major misconception is that Saxo was this... He hated the Nordic pagan gods, and I don't think he did at all. He reserves a euhemeristic spot for them, like we talked about. They are wizards, not true gods. And this is what all authors do in the north. But they are not demons, which is the other path he could have chosen. Saxo knew about demons and knew about demonological tropes and how to write them. And he uses those tropes to characterize the gods of the Slavs who the Danes conquered in Saxo's time.
Interesting. So if he had been really adverse to the Norse gods, he would have probably applied those same types of demon tropes to them as well. But instead, he sets them up as these, even though they may be wizards and, like you said, conjurers of tricks at times, they're not demons. They are heroic figures in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I mean, it's of course a complicated exposition, but even though they are ultimately like fallible gunmen, really, he doesn't hate them. And even like Thor, he receives no criticism at all by Saxo. And even Odin, who is like very ambiguous figure in Gesta Danorum, in book 8, he's mentioned as always having fostered the Danes with like a fatherly affection.
Mm-hmm.
And Odin has also instructed and a lot of Danish kings and giving them knowledge, right? So it's a very complicated exposition of the pagan gods, but at the same time, pagan gods and giants and whatever, they have a tendency in Gesta Danorum to appear outside of Denmark, and the Danes have this tendency to kill minor gods.
Right.
So it's complicated, but it's not the frothing at the mouth madness that some scholars believe.
Right. He's got to be true to his Christianity, I imagine. And he doesn't want to start looking like too much of a paganism fanboy, but at the same time, he really could have gone a lot worse than he did with the Norse gods.
Exactly, and it sounds apologetic, and maybe it is, but I think he couldn't criticize the pagan gods too much because they were like the native pantheon, really.
Right. So it's interesting. One of the things that I've tried really hard to wrap my head around is where these gods live in the mindset of your average Scandinavian Christian in the late 1100s, early 1200s. Obviously, they have been Christian for 2 centuries-ish now. Well, at least in Iceland they have. In Denmark, even longer. Does the public at large at this point have kind of a euhemeristic idea of the gods, or is that something that's just circling in educated groups? Are the gods still showing up a lot in folklore? I'm interested in sort of understanding what the average person's mind was like in terms of how they perceived the ancient belief system.
I wish I knew the answer. And I think a lot of
one of those difficult questions.
Yeah, and I think a lot of scholars would also very much like to know the answer, because the euhemeristic model is, of course, a learned theory that circulates within the utmost strata of society. I don't think any peasants, farmers, fishermen, whatever, would know about this at all. But at the same time, folklore would still be alive. You know, you have mentions of pre-Christian gods circulating in folklore in like the 19th century. Mm-hmm. Of course, it must have existed then, but we don't know in what form at all.
Yeah, that's interesting and sad all at the same time. But you know what's interesting? What's interesting too about Saxo and the position that he takes, because there seems to be, as I read it, lots of sort of competing ideas all the time. Like it's like a pendulum that kind of swings to one side in one moment and then swings back to the other side in another moment. You know, he wants to glorify the Danish fatherland, for example, and yet at the same time he'll use things like calling his Danish ancestors barbarians versus the quote intelligent Romans, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes. But the barbarian thing, I think it's because he is a learned man of the church. He has to wag his fingers and say, "Got fooled by the pagan wizards. You are so stupid."
Right.
But as for how he uses barbarians, besides for the ancient Danes, then he uses it for the Baltic peoples and the Slavs. You know, people at the fringe of civilization. They are like prime candidates for receiving the business end of a sword, right?
And Saxo has a lot of people who are prime candidates for receiving the business end of a sword. You and I were...
It's a long list.
Yeah, you and I were talking about the story of Starkother as it appears in Gesta Danorum, and this is maybe something that a lot of people will be interested in because Starkother, of course, he's the famous hero from Gautrek Saga, which is very famous. He shows up in a lot of places in Norse mythology, and Saxo has the longest Starkother story you will find anywhere. I mean, page upon page upon page of Starkother, which he calls Starkotherus, I guess, in Latin. But he seems to be, kind of this shining example of what a man should be in Saxo's mind, right? And it's all about class structure, and it's all about living in moderation, and it's all about preferring war and the basic things in life as opposed to comforts and opulence and stuff like that. And it makes me wonder how much of these virtues that he imposes on a character like Starkother, how many of those are these classical virtues that you mentioned, and how much does that compete with what might have been pre-Christian virtues at the time when Starkother, assuming he was a real person, would have really lived?
Well, he's kind of an interesting figure in that Starkother he's like this pagan Terminator that's blessed by Odin and cursed by Thor.
Right.
Always speaking in poetry, and he's like just killing machine, and it's kind of an art choice for Saxo to really like, but he is a fan, I think. And I think he might have seen something of himself in Starkother, at least in the way he himself presented him. So that's an easy self-insert to make.
Sure.
But in this constant criticizing of weak, decadent kings who that the Germans influenced them too much. But it's kind of hard to really decide if Starkother's ethical code is like Saxo's work, or if it's something that was there all along, and then maybe Saxo expanded upon it, which I think he did. Because Starkother he hates the commoners in all sources. It's what he does. He's an aristocratic killing machine.
Right.
Blessed by a mad god.
Unless you're a farmer, right? If you're a farmer, that's respectable because you don't earn anything for what you've worked for.
Yeah. Good, honest work, and not tradesmen, not goldsmiths, not foreigners, not slaves.
Right. That was something fascinating too. Starkother/Saxo is completely fine with blacksmithing, but goldsmithing is just, some loser thing to do. Right.
Yeah, decadent and useless. but that is also informed by some passage that we don't know today, in which Starkother gets his ass kicked by blacksmiths.
Right.
and they earn his respect that way. It's like, oh, you're good enough. You kicked my ass. Really showed me.
Yeah, well, he does take that attitude because there's the moment where, who is it? Is it King Ingjald who he breaks into his bedroom, but his wife has told him, Starkother's probably going to try to kill you, but if you just stab him first, then he'll think that you're manly and he'll stop trying to kill you. And it works, right? Doesn't he? He stabs Starkother right in the forehead or something. And then Starkother's like, all right, you're manly enough. Okay, I guess you don't deserve to die after all.
Yeah, it's a great story. It's not Ingjald. I think it's a Helgi.
Oh, that's right. It was Helgi.
He's supposed to show up to this massive duel against like a band of berserks, but he sleeps in his bed, and Starkother actually goes to wake him up, but sees him in the embrace of his lover, wife, or whatever it is, and he decides that he won't wake him up, so he goes himself to the duel and waits in the middle of the winter, and just sits on this hill covered in snow like something out of The Shining. And then, like, casually massacres these other dudes.
Yeah.
And gets this serious wound where his guts are hanging out of his stomach or something. And then he goes back to the chamber. And then the episode you just described happens.
Right.
And he's like, oh, you're a tough dude after all.
I guess you would have been tough if I decided to wake you up. But that is really interesting. You're right. I remember that because he goes to wake him up, and I think that Helgi and his wife were newly married, and he didn't want to break up what seemed like such a nice moment between the two of them who were brand new married or something like that. But then it causes him to
Exactly.
get his guts sliced open, and I love that part because he crawls over to a stream to try and get a drink of water with his intestines hanging out, but then he sees that the water's been contaminated by some blood, so he's like, I'm just not going to drink it. And then in a scene that's almost like reminds me of the Good Samaritan story from the New Testament. A few different people come by and see him laying there, but in this case, everyone offers to help, and he's refusing help from everybody because of their station in life. It's an amazing story, and I feel like anybody who wants to write a book about Vikings, for example, because we see this online a lot, right? People ask all kinds of questions because they want to write a story about Vikings. They want to write a book about Vikings. I think anybody who wants to get attitudes of manliness that show up with regard to these types of heroes in the sources ought to read the Starkather's story from Gesta Danorum, because everything is about how Starkather thinks about something in its relationship to whether or not it's something a man should be doing or not. And he takes action based on that almost exclusively throughout the whole thing.
Yeah, and it's so over the top all of the time.
Yeah, like I mentioned, he punches a princess in the face because she's about to sleep with a goldsmith.
That'll teach her.
Yeah, she'll never make that mistake again.
Yeah, but this is the sister of the king whose feast he interrupts and turns into a massacre.
Right, because he's
Right. So,
he's mad because all the food is too nice, right? And the queen is trying to give him unmanly gifts, like she just doesn't get it, right? She tries to give him, I think it's like her own golden crown or something like that. And I think he throws two different things back in her face that she tries to give him in that story, because they're both unmanly gifts that he shouldn't have, and he's mad about them. Oh, and that's right. And they try to appease him by having a musician play, and he just throws a bone musician and hits him in the face, and then the musician starts crying. And Saxo's like, and thus we see that when you live a life of comfort, you become a crybaby.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. The whole story is that Ingjald has failed to avenge the killing of his father and instead married into the family of his father's killers. And dedicated life to like sloth and avarice and greed and all these German luxuries.
Mm-hmm. The luxurious life he sort of equates with being effeminate as a man.
Yeah, the neat part is that Saxo uses the same wording and like scene to describe the effeminate and decadent habits of Svend III, I think he was, one of the kings competing for the throne of Denmark in Saxo's own time. So Starkather's Saxo are like mirror images of the same extremely harsh critic of this feminine and foreign influence on weak kings. And it's a thing you see constantly in Gesta Danorum, where the ancient past is a mirror or like a foreboding incidence of what will come to pass later in the historical period of Denmark's history.
Interesting. So would it be fair to say that it's almost like Saxo is making critiques of things that are going on within royalty at his time by the way he writes about the past?
Yeah, definitely.
That's amazing. And I guess I don't know if that's the sort of thing that would put a guy like Saxo at risk, but it seems, well, I mean, I guess if all your kings are weak, you're not too scared of them.
Well, the king he criticized was like the main competitor for the throne of Denmark. So in criticizing him, he says, the current dynasty of Denmark, they're the good guys. The competitors, decadent, effeminate, German.
Right.
Right.
And that's interesting, because so Saxo, he really likes to kind of put this manly focus on the historical Danes, but he will take other Germanic groups, like you've been mentioning the Germans, and call them effeminate. But another one that he mentions, again, this is in the Starkather story, I read it recently, as you can probably tell, is he criticizes the people that he calls the sons of Frö in Sweden for being too effeminate. And in this case, he doesn't like actors on the stage. He doesn't like tinkling bells, and he doesn't like I recall correctly, what Saxo calls womanish body movements. But in this case, it's
yeah.
Swedes. And I remember this was an instance that Gunnel uses to point out how the idea of Freyr worship was considered kind of this other thing. Like it wouldn't have been as normal in Iceland and Denmark. It would have been this thing more coming out of Sweden. And whether or not that's the case is another thing. But it's interesting that Saxo is taking other groups that I think a lot of times when we look back on Norse history sort of as a monolith, we think that these guys all sort of consider themselves the same in some way, all these Germanic groups. But at least by this point in time, they're really starting to solidify into their own identities to the point that Saxo is willing to call everybody else effeminate, except for, us Great Danes.
Yeah. The thing is that Swedes in both Gesta Danorum and Icelandic literature have this reputation of being like backwatersy pagan hicks, really.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why you find all of these weird references to their cult, because they were the last nation to convert to Christianity.
Right.
So they had like this special connected to them. But also, a thing that also plays into that description is that for some reason, entertainers like minstrels or jugglers or whatever were universally hated by Scandinavian authors.
Jugglers were universally hated?
Yeah, and it's also why that guy who got a bone in his face is like a big crybaby. And you find this other places in Gesta Danorum too. It's like this intense mistrust and critique of this new mode of entertainment, probably because it comes from courtly milieus in like Germany and England, and also because they etched out the native entertainment cultural capital, like Skalds, for example.
Yeah, it's interesting because right after Starkadr throws a bone at this guy whose job is to play music on a flute and a harp, I think he might have been doing both or something like that. But he immediately gets up and he starts insulting everybody through verse, right? And Saxo, well, at least in the English translation, the word they use is song. So he's mad at this guy for putting on music, and then he immediately gets up and starts reciting song/poetry. And so, it's interesting how the distinction is drawn between those two things.
It is. Skalds didn't see themselves as belonging to the same group as these minstrels and jugglers and whatnot, circus people. I guess you can call them like carnies, to use an American term.
Sure. Like they just travel around and just do some entertainment for a while and then take off and leave.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's important to note that Starkadr is a Skald too. So
he's a freestyler. He comes up with it right on the spot, just insult after insult.
One of Odin's blessings.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Okay, actually, so we're starting to run out of time here, but I wanted to jump back to the question of Odin a little bit in Gesta Danorum. So there are two instances in Gesta Danorum where Odin gets exiled. The first happens because he voluntarily goes into exile, I think, after Frigg cheats on him. And then the second one is right after he has disguised himself as a medicine woman in order to get close enough to Rindr to take advantage of her and then father to give birth to a son, which will come back to me right after we're done talking. But anyways, so he goes into exile this time because he's forced into it because of the womanish things he did during that trick. Not necessarily because he did anything bad to Rindr herself, but because he dressed up like a woman to do it. And then there is another instance in Heimskringla where we get Frigg sleeping with Odin's two brothers while he's gone for a long time. It doesn't necessarily say, well, it doesn't say that he's been exiled there. But what's interesting is there seems to be this idea, and I think doesn't this also show up in Lokasenna at one point. There's a reference to Frigg sleeping with Odin's brothers at one point, I believe, that Loki mentions.
It does.
But I guess this idea of Odin being exiled and sort of disappearing for a long time, and maybe this having something to do with his wife's infidelity. Do you have any thoughts or opinions on whether or not this is drawn from a lost myth, or whether or not I'm just sort of, putting too many little pieces together from euhemeristic works?
No, I think you are definitely on the right track. In Heimskringla, it's the saga called Ynglinga Saga, as you say, and that saga, we know it postdates Saxo, so he can't have used that. But it does occur in Lokasenna, as you say, that Frigg has been engaging in adultery. This is one exile we also find in Gesta Danorum, or one reason for exile. Mm-hmm. But I know you have talked a lot about the Rind story in your podcast. And do you recall the name that Odin assumes when he carries out this shameful deed?
Yes, it was in Gesta Danorum, it's Wecha. W-E-C-H-A is the anglicized version of it. I forget what it looks like in the Latin.
Exactly. But I think there is something interesting going on, because this adulterous episode is known from Lokasenna. And we also know from Lokasenna that Odin, he appeared in the guise of a witki or whatever, the same word that you discussed. So I think that the exiles in Gesta Danorum both points towards Lokasenna as some kind of source.
Right.
Because the reasons for the exiles are found there down to word level description.
Yeah, it's interesting that I don't believe there's any mention of an exile that comes from anything that's reasonably pre-Christian. Is that true?
Yeah, it's true. And we might also note that situation in Gesta Danorum and Ynglinga Saga, it looks alike, right? The reason for the exile and the even the mentioning of exile in general.
Right. Yeah, it continues to sadden me that so much material has been lost. Although it's also amazing how much material has been retained when you think about it as well.
It's an amazing stroke of luck that we know anything, basically.
Yeah, I read Gesta Danorum, and one of the things that I've been sort of starting to dip my feet more into as well is Celtic mythology, and I've started in the Irish side of things. And all we have in terms of Celtic mythology, outside of just some obscure archaeological finds, are euhemerized works written by monks. And it's hard to know who in here would have been a god sometimes versus just a hero of legend, and it's really interesting, and it makes me think that Norse mythology might have been similar if we had only ended up with, let's say, Heimskringla, Gesta Danorum, stuff like that, and we hadn't been lucky enough to have somebody decide that they needed to spend all this time and money writing down these ancient pagan poems that had been passed down for a couple hundred years. Also, luckily, right?
Definitely. I mean, it's a wonder, really, and we are lucky, I should say, to have something that isn't packed into like this weird interpretational frame that we just have poetry, really.
Yeah, and the poetry is some amazing stuff too. We could get into that for another hour if we wanted to, but I think we're probably about out of time. I guess before we wrap up here, one of my hopes has been that this episode and some of the other stories, I did an episode on the Rinder story, for example. My hope has been to inspire more people to read Gesta Danorum, because even though I admittedly have not read every word of the entire thing, what I have read, especially the stuff that's in the first few books, where we're dealing with some of the legendary heroes that show up in sagas, and we're dealing with characters that are gods and other material, is really fascinating stuff. And even if it is euhemeristic, and even though there is some influence from the classical tradition coming out of Greece and Rome, and sort of the courtly tradition of the later medieval period, there's also just a lot of really cool insight into the types of things that at least people in Saxo's time would have thought to be characteristic of the pagan period. And they're at least closer than we are, right? So I guess I would encourage everybody to pick this up and read it. Don't let it be this thing that is scary and scholarly that you only hear podcasters and YouTubers talk about. And I guess if you have any other points points of encouragement to throw out for people to read Gesta Danorum, now would be the time.
Sure, I think people should just read the first 9 books and be entertained. They're fun stories. Like it's what you think of when you think of Viking sagas, like crazy duels, dragons, pagan gods, daring Viking raids, and all the good stuff. And I also think that you should pirate Oxford edition. You can't afford it. It's too expensive. It's not priced from. I don't say this to imply anything, but it's
that.
It's not priced for mortals. It's not priced for mortals. You don't read the crusty old 19th century translation. Get the new one and don't pay for it. Be an internet Viking.
All right, and there you have it from somebody who's maintaining more anonymity than me. Something that I cannot endorse, but one potential way you could physically get a copy, or I guess digitally get a copy of Gesta Danorum. But you're right, it's wonderful, and my recommendation, of course, I believe is the same as yours. It's the Jensen and Fisher edition, which I believe is 2015, if memory serves. So it's not too old. Once again, I appreciate you coming on and talking about your specialty. I always enjoy reading the comments and the posts you make. Oh, you have a blog that you've recently started with a few posts on there specifically about Gesta Danorum. Do you want to plug that in case people are interested in kind of dipping their toes in the water a little bit?
Yeah, it's historyofthedanes.blogspot.com. And it's a mix between obscure deep dives into Gesta Danorum and just me being angry at other scholars.
That's what makes it so much more enjoyable, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Anyways, I guess I keep thanking you, but just to sign off here, once again, thank you, AtiWati, so much for coming on, and I hope that you will entertain the idea of maybe coming back on again to talk more in the future.
Definitely. It has been a pleasure.
All right, we'll talk to you later. Thanks for listening, everybody. Until next time on Norse Mythology, the Unofficial Guide.